Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Joel Hunter, host of Power Talks, empowering you through the voice of truth. On today's program, we have we're going to approach a very large issue, the opioid crisis, but we're not going to take care of the crisis. We're going to talk personally and practically about those who are going through difficult times and maybe some ways that we can be of help. We've got two resident experts here. Spencer Fleiterer, I love this guy because he lived in my hometown. We didn't know each other.
No, we did
but
not.
Hardly anybody knows where Shelby, Ohio is, but Spencer does.
Yep.
But he runs a mission called Central Care Mission. It is a residential facility for men who are going through and recovering from addictions. Spence himself has some background with addiction.
Unfortunately, that's true.
Yeah, and so he is even more of an expert because he's been through it.
Yes, sir.
And then Janet Hutchison, fascinating, grew up in South Africa, is a PhD psychiatric nurse practitioner with the
Orange Blossom Health.
Thank you, Orange Blossom Health, associated with health care for the homeless. She spent time, she was 20 years in the military, oversaw a mental health unit in northern Iraq. So she's been all over the place. And thank you for being on with us today. This is just awesome.
Privileged to be here.
Let me ask specifically, Janet. You deal with. I couldn't believe when I heard your caseload is like 750 to 1,000 people, because you don't deal just with addictions. You deal with all spectrum of mental health issues. And you're over lots of different counseling personnel. But having said that, since we want to talk specifically about the opioid crisis, tell us some of the things that you're dealing with at the center of people who maybe you didn't expect to see in there. Maybe there were some surprises of people who got involved in this addiction, that got involved in weird ways, or went through a gateway drug or something to get to where they are today. How do you approach that?
Well, when I first started at Orange Blossom about 5 years ago, I had really not expected to come back into working in addictions. And then about 2 to 3 years ago, we started seeing people come in who were perhaps being seen in a methadone clinic or had been elsewhere and were still struggling with their addiction. And with the help of Mr. Burns and our behavioral health team, we put together some grants to be able to treat patients who are coming in specifically with an opioid addiction, as well as some of the other related addictions that do occur. And we also see people in the jail, and our team is responsible primarily for women who are coming out of Orange County Jail, and then we can see them afterwards and treat them long term for their opiate addiction.
Is an opioid addiction different than other types of addictions, or are they all kind of the same pattern?
They all ultimately affect the brain in the same way, and the way we talk about it is that when you can't function normally without having that drug, and by the time Spence sees patients and I see them, they've made that decision that things have to change. There's a different process sometimes of getting people to that point. So when they've reached that bottom and they're willing to change is when they come and see us for the first time.
Yeah, it's not a disease so much as it is a brain malfunction where your brain becomes addicted to a substance, and dopamine is shoved in the area of the brain that wants the opioid. And so your brain is just saying, I want this, I want this, I want this. And when you get that substance, then the dopamine rush leaves for a period of time until your brain says, I want it again. And so your brain almost self-sabotages.
And that's where the concept of a disease comes in. Just like a diabetic, if they use too much ice cream, are going to have a diabetic crisis as it goes up. And we have to look at addiction as the same way. And I often compare it to something like if somebody breaks an ankle And I did have a patient 25 years ago who jumped off a 2-story building, and this was at the Healthcare for the Homeless when I was there a long time ago. And he didn't have money to get his ankle fixed. So he walked on a broken ankle, and we got x-rays on it about 10 years later. And he had no movement in the ankle, and it was just sort of a big mass of calcium. Well, I explained that that's what happens in your brain when you continue to pound it with opiates or alcohol or cocaine or any of those drugs of addiction, is that you distort the neuron that's involved in that release of dopamine. And it takes months to years to try and get that better. So it's not a quick fix.
I've heard that there are some drugs that if you I've heard two things, and so that's why I'm asking you. That if you like smoke crack, it's immediately addictive. You know, I've heard other things where there are some people who are more prone to addiction than not. Which are both of those true?
Well, each of our brains are developed differently. They have the ability to process dopamine and serotonin and all the other chemicals properly, and some brains don't. So if my brain's not functioning properly, and then all of a sudden I get a drug, I'm going to feel some sense of relief of a lack that I had in my brain, and that's what creates more tendency towards addiction.
Okay.
The other, what do you think is the most addictive substance? It's hardest for people to get off of. I think you'd be surprised.
Well,
and you might disagree with this. But
We've always heard.
Yeah,
we've always heard. I mean, just lay people. That it was heroin.
Yeah, it's not. It's tobacco.
It's tobacco.
Really?
Yeah. I got guys getting off of heroin, all kinds of different drugs, and smoking, and they cannot quit. It's tobacco.
That is fascinating.
Isn't that something?
I'll be.
Yeah.
But it really does depend on your particular brain. And I go back to one of the first patients I ever saw when I started working in detox on Gore Street back in around 2000, 2001. And I had this young girl come in. She was probably in her early 20s at that time. And she said, well, the first time I used heroin was when somebody at a party said, hey, you want to try that? And I injected it. And you know, at that minute, I knew I would use that for the rest of my life.
Yeah,
because,
really?
And she did. She became an addict almost immediately. While there are other people who can use opiates, if you've taken Percocet for a toothache for 2 days, you don't worry when you don't have any more on the third day. Your brain can deal with that. But there are people who can use something one time and the brain says, I need more of it.
Yeah.
So it's very individualized.
Spence, you've shared with me as I came to your facility, which is a wonderful, boy, what a great ministry you've got. It's just, you're doing so much good in this community. But you shared with me, you had a background of using drugs. When you were going through that, I mean, were you going, this isn't good, or were you just saying, I just needed the next deal?
Well, the problem with drugs is when you first start, you're saying this is good.
Okay.
Okay, and the drugs are the biggest liar. They're going to tell you it's going to be good and it's going to stay good, and then you march down a couple years, or depending on how much you use, and then you say, oh, this is starting to get bad, and then you don't pull the trigger to get help, and then pretty soon you hit a brick wall and you say, oh, I have messed everything up, and that's the crisis point. You're going to go one direction or the other.
Both of you see people at the crisis point. I mean, on the one hand, it's you've got to hit bottom. You know, the old saying is you got to hit bottom, you know, before you realize you need help. The other side of that is, do you just kind of lose all hope and just say, you know, this is who I am. I'll never get out of this.
Some do.
Yeah, some do, and that's where they need to be. They need truth. They need love. They need a support unit, and hopefully they don't. With the opioid epidemic and crisis, hopefully they don't die before that, and someone can get to them and try to just get a little truth in there to say, hey, we can help you. In many cases,
a voice. I'm just thinking of who's listening right now. Yeah. A voice that says, you really can beat this. You can.
I think the biggest thing, Joel, is for someone who's listening that maybe is addicted to prescription drugs, and there's hope for transformation. Yeah. there is hope that your life does not have to always be this way.
Yeah.
And not only can you not be an addict any longer, it's not just getting off of drugs, it's getting on with life.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's the hope.
It's being able to develop trust with the patient and not being judgmental. And one of the things I usually say is, when you were 12 years old, did you grow up and say you were going to be at age 12, say, I'm going to be an opiate addict when I grow up? No, you didn't. And it's taken you 12 years to get to the point to come in. It's going to take you 12 years before you can say, I'm back now to where I want to be. It's not something that you can get a shot of naltrexone or Narcan by the police and I'm done with opiates.
Yeah.
No,
Thank
you're
you
not.
for saying that, because that's the solution that's being presented in our
and
society.
It's not the solution.
Let's get you on naltrexone and let's get you on Narcan and all this, but that's dealing with the symptom.
Okay.
It doesn't deal with the cause.
Yeah, okay.
And so she's exactly right. And that's why our program's a year. It's not 30 or 60, 90 days with a little insurance program to go to a resort.
Right.
It takes a long time to rebuild life skills.
Yeah.
How do I handle my money?
Yeah.
How do I handle my emotions? How do I heal from past hurts? These are the core issues.
That's such a good point, because this is not about just detoxing.
No, it's not.
This is about building a new life, isn't it?
Detox, Joel, just to get you where you kind of think halfway decent.
And then you walk out of detox and you usually relapse within 2 weeks, unless you are totally surrounded by people who are going to love you and give you a feeling of there's something to take the place of that drug.
Okay.
Community.
Is it, because I know, a lot of the general population, and I count myself as being totally ignorant about drugs. I was one of the few people that came through the 60s, never smoked marijuana.
Good for you.
I just know. And there's no credit to that. I was just scared to death because I come from a long line of alcoholics, and I knew, buddy, I've got that tendency. If I ever start, I'm gone. So I was scared enough not to go there. But having said that, now I'm totally ignorant about these matters. And I know that the general population feels very ignorant. And so they're reluctant to intrude with somebody who they feel is maybe, going down the wrong path or having a problem and so on and so forth. What would you say to somebody like that?
One of the things we have to do is destigmatize this epidemic. You have all stratas of society using this, including white-collar professionals, and to destigmatize it, Joel, the biblical truth is if you hide something, it gains power.
Yeah.
That's in a good way. If you have an experience that's good and you keep it and you hold it, it builds gravity, it builds good force. But if you're doing something wrong, it also builds gravity and takes control. And so to be able to not hide any longer, and that hopefully our conversation destigmatizes.
Yeah.
And just tell somebody, tell somebody, I am using opiates and I'm afraid I'm addicted.
Yeah.
But it's also important to let the general population know what an opiate is, because many people will come to me and say, well, I'm taking ibuprofen. Am I going to get addicted to that? Because that's a pain reliever. And they don't talk to their doctor about what's an opiate, what is not.
What is an opiate?
An opiate is it can be either synthetic or it can be natural, which comes from the poppy, and that's where, of course, where heroin comes from. And morphine is also a substrate of that group. But a lot of things like oxycodone and more recently fentanyl and some of the other synthetic opiates are what are absolutely deadly, and that nobody knows what they get when they buy heroin, because you don't know how many times it's been cut or what's it been cut with, and that's why people are dying.
I had an addict at the mission, a gentleman, let's not call him an addict because I teach them they are not going to be addicts forever, but he said when you go out tonight to use heroin, on a scale of 1 to 10, you might get a 2. So if you spend $100 and you just get 2, you're going to be upset. So tomorrow night, you're going to go out and you're going to spend $200 because you think you're getting 2 again when you're getting a powerful 8. Wow. And if you use it all, and if it has a little bit of synthetic opioids in it, carfentanil or fentanyl, that's what will kill you. So there's no standardized way of knowing what you're getting. And that just creates chaos.
Drill down on that just a little bit, because again, general population, So people can just go out on the corners and buy this stuff?
You can, but it's usually not quite that easy, and it takes an addict to know one.
Okay.
And you can walk into a 7-Eleven, or one of our people on heroin can walk into a 7-Eleven, or, and I hate to pull up a name brand, or a gas station, or anywhere else where drugs tend to be sold, and they will know who's selling and who's using.
You can get heroin any day of the week,
in any place
hour,
you
24
want.
hours a day, anywhere. You just got to know where to go.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Which is frightening.
yeah.
It is frightening.
Let's talk about, just for a moment, rather than the person who is becoming, dependent on these drugs. Let's talk about their families. You at the mission, and certainly you at the clinic, do you know about their relationships? You know about who's trying to help or who isn't, and so on and so forth. How important is it for families to be educated about the dynamics of addiction or the dynamics of drug use?
It's very important, but it's also important for the family to realize when they're enabling the person and when they need to use tough love. And those are that's a very difficult line to walk. When somebody comes in really distraught about what their family member is doing. I had somebody, actually it was this morning, who came in, and I was seeing him for something else, and he said, my stepson died last week of a drug overdose in East Orlando.
Wow.
And so that will haunt him all his life.
Yeah.
Don't think that your family is immune to it.
not
If you go
immune.
to the dentist and you get 30 days of a prescription and you only take two or a day, don't leave it in your medicine cabinet
that's
where
a
your
good-
children or other friends of their children can come and they use a bathroom and they're gonna look
That's
through.
a really good. I've never thought about that.
Yeah, so you got to be on your toes. Watch for all the indicators in your own child: isolation, extreme mood change. Of course, when they hit middle school, that's all happens. That's part of it. But you just got to watch, and just, it's not a lower class issue. It's a middle class issue.
Yeah.
And it's because, and heroin now is cheaper than the oxycodone used to be 10 years ago. And we really did go from heroin to oxycodone to dilaudid and back to heroin as we got more sophisticated in how to track pill mills. That went out, and then heroin has become incredibly much cheaper now.
So I don't know if you've seen the research, Jana, but so when the opioid crisis was there and there were a lot of prescriptions, some of those people, when the prescriptions were removed from the market, went to heroin.
And they still do.
But now what's happening, yes, and they still do, but what's happening now primarily is one-to-one heroin. So I'm a heroin user, she's never used heroin. Hey, you want to try this with me? People don't go out and use heroin the first time on their own, all by themselves. It's someone else introducing them. So what they've done is they've bypassed the prescription drug situation now, and it's heroin to heroin user introducing a future heroin user. It's no longer prescription drugs primarily as the vehicle of introduction.
But it will also be somebody who perhaps was in a car accident and were on prescription drugs for 6 months, and then the doctor says no more.
Yeah.
Right.
And
they got to get
then
it.
the buddy says, hey, I know where we can get something that's much cheaper.
Yeah.
And they'll go find the heroin.
Okay.
And then they'll often use heroin intranasally rather than injecting it, oftentimes for several years before they start injecting. So it's a disease that it just progresses. It's like a cancer. Yeah. It just progresses and progresses until it really totally engulfs your life.
One of the things we were talking about what it does to the brain. I don't know how much time. I want to talk about solutions.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
We're about to
Okay.
get there.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
We're painting this bleak picture, and it is bleak.
Yeah.
It's a crisis in our nation and in our community. But there are.
Well, let's go there. Let's go to what do we do? Give us some constructive steps that we can take.
We do have solutions. It depends really on how deeply they are involved, whether or not they go to detox, whether they go as a voluntary or an involuntary, because there is something called a marchman that a family member can do when they really feel that their family member needs help but is unwilling to recognize it. And they have found that even involuntary detoxes work. So that's the route that if that's necessary, we will refer people who come in and they say they're ready for this. We'll call the detox on Gore, or we'll just have the police come and take them to Aspire if that's what that they want to do. And then we see them again afterwards. And we have a couple of tools. The one that I like the best is called naltrexone, which is a long-acting opiate blocker. It's not for everybody, but if people are worried about the craving, once they're out of detox, they can get the shot. And it works for 30 days. Okay. But it doesn't work if you don't have counseling, if you don't do all those life skill changes. Yeah. I prefer to see it given when somebody is not in a controlled environment, like Central Care Mission, because there they've got resources around them, they've got their family around them. And then it works, and we see people coming out of these long-term programs who do incredibly well. It's much more difficult when they're coming out with very little support system.
The interesting part of naltrexone, I think, is it's not only a craving inhibitor, it's a pleasure inhibitor.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So if you use it, it inhibits your ability to feel the euphoria if you use again.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's not, and it takes away the craving. And then who's going to want to go out and use it? You spend money and do it, and you don't even get high.
Exactly.
So it's a double inhibitor. I think the other thing that is really encouraging is, from a neuroscience point of view, is we've all heard this is your brain on drugs and seeing the fried egg. When in the 70s, when I did drugs, I thought my life was over because I thought I had fried my brain. There's no hope for education. There's no hope for me to succeed in my life. And what I tell the guys in our program at Central Care Mission is, there is hope. Neuroscience says your brain can be rewired. Yeah. It can actually change all the neural pathways, and that's done by exercise. And you saw all of our exercise stuff. Yeah. That's done by reading and learning new information, whether that's learning how to play chess or checkers or learning new stuff. Your brain just starts directing everything the different direction. And then it's interesting, and one more point is meditation and prayer. So isn't it interesting that God has created our brain so that when we talk to Him and focus on Him, it changes our brain from something that was once destructive to something that's healthy. Yeah. And so I think that's hope for an addict.
Absolutely.
That their brain doesn't have to be damaged the rest of their life.
That's right.
It just takes time to get well, and it takes the people around you. It's not something that somebody can do very well on their own. And there are always exceptions. But for the most part, those people who do best are those who are able to generate a support system or be thrown into a situation where that support system and that connection with God is also important.
I'm so glad you're saying that, because we're a one-year program. And, I'm a kind of a practitioner. She's a PhD, and she keeps saying it takes time, it takes time. And if people are out there listening right now, when you need to come into a program. If it takes you 5 years to get lost in the woods, you aren't going to get out the next day. Yeah.
Well, it makes all kinds of sense, because God made us for relationships. I mean, the essence of life is love and being loved, and God is love, and so He made us to need each other. And so, no matter how strong-willed you are, if you're talking about rewiring your brain, I keep thinking of Jesus' words, "Behold, I make all things new." No, I meant all things new. Right. It will go much better if you have those reinforcing messages from the outside. It's not just, what am I trying to get my brain to do? It is, what kind of input do I have from the people I value and the people that value me? That's going to make the biggest turnaround.
Be transformed by the renewing of your mind.
Yeah, exactly.
And we really try to keep our program open. So if somebody has a step backwards, and part of recovery is oftentimes is relapse, is that we don't say, well, go away, come back at a later time. We will see them then, and we will work with them to try. And we have people who come back a year later who say, I need to get back in with you guys, I need counseling, I need to try the Vivitrol again. And I have patients I saw 15 years ago who come back in and say, hey, I'm still doing well.
Oh, good.
And so it is not a hopeless situation.
It's not a mathematical equation.
It's not an equation. Everybody is unique.
If we knew that, we'd be millionaires. The human is complex.
You bet. And we're saved by grace. Thank you for this. Boy, this is way too short. I need some more. You guys to come back, but this is so important to destigmatize, as you have just said, Shame is our enemy. It doesn't do anybody any good. It just takes away the energy you need to get better. Shame. I'm stumbling with my words here, but unfortunately, religious people have been some of the priests, some of the chief provocators of that kind of shame. But this is a personal and gracious remedy for when things go wrong in our life. Hey, we're out of time, but Spence, Janet, thank you so much. I love it. This was lively. I've learned so much. Thank you. And those of you who are listening in, you can do something. If you see someone who is having a difficult time in their life, speak into their lives. Tell them how much hope there is and how valuable they are. And do whatever you can for the practical steps they need to take to encourage them toward those steps that they need to get healthy again. And so remember, these discussions are just that. They're discussions among us. But we'd love to see you continue the discussions at home and go one step further. Get involved. Because when power talks, you are empowered through the voice of truth. See you next time.